I did not lose my marriage to a late-night affair. I lost it to a hostile takeover masquerading as family loyalty, orchestrated right in my kitchen while I carried my first child. My husband and my sister thought an exhausted, pregnant woman would quietly surrender her home and dignity. They forgot a mother pushed to the edge, burns the bridge with them standing on it. The way I dismantled their lives was a masterpiece. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for your incredible support. But unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to continue operating, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and will transition our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel to hear exclusive, true stories that are even better and much longer, featuring highly detailed situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, all brought to life by a cast of emotional voice actors. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive right into today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Tabitha Cannon. I was 31 years old and standing at the absolute peak of my life. I was a self-made woman who had poured every ounce of my soul, sweat, and sleepless nights into building AuraSync Solutions, a rapidly growing data analytics software company based in Denver, Colorado. My business was thriving, my bank accounts were secure, and life felt completely aligned. The ultimate validation of my happiness came when I discovered I was pregnant with my first child. My husband, Julian, and I were finally starting the family we had dreamed of. My world felt warm, complete, and utterly untouchable, or so I thought. The first crack in my perfect reality did not sound like breaking glass. It sounded like a ringing telephone on a rainy evening. It was my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe had always been the designated victim of our family, forever stumbling from one self-inflicted disaster to the next, while expecting everyone else to clean up the wreckage. This time, it was a messy personal bankruptcy. She called me in hysterics, crying so hard she could barely breathe, begging for a safe haven to get her life back together. Historically, Julian had absolutely zero patience for my sister. He used to complain endlessly about her chronic irresponsibility and her unique ability to drain the energy out of any room she entered. Yet, on that particular evening, his reaction was bafflingly different. Instead of rolling his eyes or groaning about her drama, he adopted a mask of profound generosity. "We have the space," he said smoothly, placing a comforting, warm hand on my shoulder. "She is family. Tabitha. Let us bring her here to our suburban house for a few months until she gets back on her feet." I was exhausted from my first trimester nausea, battling daily fatigue, so I agreed, foolishly mistaking his strange eagerness for genuine compassion. It did not take long for the atmosphere in my home to shift. The erosion of my boundaries was not an explosion. It was a slow, deliberate leak. Chloe did not just move into the guest room. She bled into every single corner of our lives. The quiet, intimate dinners Julian and I used to share completely vanished, replaced by Chloe's loud, chaotic presence at the kitchen island every single night. I started noticing my belongings being subtly rearranged. My favorite throw blankets were suddenly folded in her room. My expensive bath products were relocated to her shower. But the most suffocating change happened in the kitchen. Chloe took over the cooking, supposedly as a thank you for our hospitality. She began preparing very specific, elaborate diet meals that Julian absolutely loved. The glaring problem was that she consistently used ingredients that I was heavily allergic to. I was suddenly starving and alienated in my own dining room, forced to make a bland sandwich while they shared a gourmet meal right in front of me. When I finally confronted Julian about how displaced I felt, about how I felt like an unwanted guest in the very house I paid the mortgage for, he let out a patronizing, heavy sigh. "Tabitha, you are being completely unreasonable," he said, shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment. "It is just the pregnancy hormones talking. They are making you selfish and paranoid. Chloe just lost everything. She is trying to help, And you cannot even find it in your heart to be sympathetic over a plate of food? He expertly spun my legitimate discomfort into a toxic character flaw because I was perpetually tired, vulnerable, and hormonal. I actually started to swallow his narrative. I began to wonder if I truly was being a terrible sister. The suffocating tension finally crystallized into a sharp, undeniable dread. One quiet night, I woke up at 2 in the morning, my throat completely dry, and made my way heavily downstairs for a glass of water. As I approached the dim kitchen, I heard soft, familiar giggling. I stepped into the doorway and instantly froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was Chloe, standing by the marble counter, wearing my expensive silk bathrobe, the exact one Julian had bought for our anniversary. It was draped loosely, intimately over her shoulders. Julian was standing much closer to her than necessary, a relaxed, boyish grin on his face that I had not seen aimed at me in months. The moment my bare feet scuffed against the hardwood floor, the laughter died instantly. They snapped their heads toward me, and a heavy, guilty, suffocating silence crashed down over the room, leaving a cold chill running straight down my spine. By the time I reached my 6th month of pregnancy, my body began to aggressively betray me. The persistent fatigue morphed into something much heavier, accompanied by severe blood pressure spikes that left my doctors deeply concerned. I was strictly ordered to reduce my stress, forcing me to transition to working from home almost entirely. It was a bitter pill to swallow, stepping back from the daily operations of AuraSync Solutions, but I had to prioritize my daughter. I leaned heavily on Julian, who already served as our chief financial officer, blindly handing over the reins of my life's work. Julian used my vulnerable state as the perfect opening. One evening, he sat on the edge of our bed, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Tabitha, Chloe is struggling," he murmured, stroking my hand. "She needs a purpose. Let me bring her into the office as an administrative assistant. It will get her out of the house during the day, give her a paycheck, and help her save up so she can finally move into her own place." The prospect of reclaiming my sanctuary was far too tempting, driven by sheer exhaustion and the desperate hope of her eventually moving out. I agreed. I unknowingly handed them the keys to my kingdom. It took less than 3 weeks for Chloe to mutate from a low-level assistant into a rogue operative. She started bypassing basic filing tasks, instead inserting herself into high-level operations. I would wake up to find blind-copied emails sent out to our top-tier clients, written entirely under my name, filled with promises and strategic shifts I had never approved. When I dragged myself into the office for a quarterly review, I found Chloe sitting at the mahogany conference table, confidently weighing in on our software development roadmap. I pulled Julian into the hallway immediately, my heart pounding with a mix of fury and panic. "Why is she in a strategy meeting?" I demanded, keeping my voice low. Julian did not flinch. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. He glanced back at the glass-walled conference room where my senior developers were watching us. "Tabitha, calm down," he whispered, his tone incredibly condescending. "You are completely overreacting again. She was just taking notes because you forgot to assign someone. You have been so scattered lately. The team is starting to notice your mood swings. Please, do not make a scene and embarrass yourself." I was systematically rewriting my reputation before my eyes. Julian was carefully cultivating an image of me to my own staff as an unhinged, overly emotional, and cognitively declining pregnant woman who could no longer handle the pressure. My employees began walking on eggshells around me, directing their questions to Julian instead. I was being isolated, painted as a hysterical liability in the very company I built from the ground up. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the office. Sitting in my home study, I began noticing bizarre anomalies in our joint bank accounts. There were massive withdrawals, strange wire transfers to shell vendors, and tens of thousands of dollars bleeding out into expenses I could not recognize. When I printed the statements and confronted Julian, demanding an explanation for the missing funds, his reaction was a masterclass in manipulation. He did not get angry. He got aggressively bureaucratic. He flooded my desk with incredibly dense, convoluted financial spreadsheets, pointing to fabricated tax codes and depreciation metrics. "We discussed this restructuring 2 weeks ago. Tabitha," he said, staring at me with cold, unblinking eyes. "Do you seriously not remember? I explained every single line item to you. I am managing our assets while you rest. And this is the thanks I get? You accusing me of stealing?" He pushed the papers closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft cadence. "You are forgetting things. Important things. It is getting genuinely concerning. Tabitha, are you sure you are feeling okay in your head?" The gaslighting was so absolute, so suffocating, that it worked. I sat alone in the dark study for hours after he left, clutching the ledgers, crying silently. I genuinely began to believe I was losing my mind. I questioned my own memories, wondering if the pregnancy was literally rotting my brain. I was completely unmoored, drifting in a thick fog of self-doubt. But the fog broke one brisk afternoon. The house was supposed to be empty. I had stepped out onto the back patio to get some fresh air, wrapping a shawl tightly around my shoulders. Down by the rose bushes, hidden behind the stone trellis, I saw Chloe. She had her back to me, pressing her phone tightly against her ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the crisp autumn air carried her words straight to me with terrifying clarity. "Do not worry," Chloe hissed into the receiver, her tone dripping with venomous anticipation. "She is about to go on full maternity leave in a few weeks. Her brain is totally fried anyway. By the time she steps away, everything will be ours." My blood ran ice cold. The crushing weight of self-doubt evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a jagged, terrifying clarity. I was not crazy. I was being hunted. The confrontation arrived on a Tuesday evening, tearing through the final shreds of my sanity. The house was dead quiet. I walked down the hallway toward my private home office to retrieve a charger. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. A harsh, pale blue light spilled out onto the dark hardwood floor. I pushed the door open. Chloe was sitting in my leather chair. My encrypted laptop was wide open. A thick black cable snaked from the USB port to a massive external hard drive resting on the desk. The cooling fan whirred aggressively. I stepped closer. The screen displayed a rapidly scrolling command terminal. Directories, file paths, and encryption keys were flashing by. It was the core repository of AuraSync Solutions. She was downloading my proprietary source code, the heartbeat of my entire company. The intellectual property I had spent 7 years building was bleeding out onto her stolen drive. Pure, blinding rage replaced my exhaustion. I lunged forward. I slammed my hand down on the keyboard and physically ripped the hard drive cable out of the port. A sharp error beep echoed in the room. Chloe jumped back, but she did not look terrified. She did not look guilty. She looked profoundly annoyed. "What are you doing?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "You are stealing my company," I screamed, the volume of my own voice tearing at my throat. "Get out. Pack your bags right now. Get out of my house. I'm cutting you off completely. We are done." Heavy. Frantic footsteps thundered down the hallway. Julian burst into the office. His chest heaved. He did not look at the computer screen. He did not look at the severed hard drive. He did not ask what was happening. His eyes locked onto me, and he marched straight across the room. "She is a thief," I yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my sister's face. "Julian, she is downloading the core algorithms." He did not stop. He did not hesitate. He raised his right hand and swung. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The force of the slap snapped my head to the side. A blinding white light flashed behind my eyes. The physical shock was so violent it threw my entire center of gravity off. My feet tangled. I stumbled backward, crashing hard against the heavy mahogany bookshelf. My breath left my lungs in a violent rush. Both of my hands instinctively flew down, wrapping fiercely around my 7-month pregnant belly. I curled inward, desperately shielding my unborn daughter from the violence in the room. My left cheek burned like fire. I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood pooling in the corner of my mouth. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. I slowly raised my head, bracing for him to drop to his knees. I waited for the horror to wash over his face. I waited for him to realize what he had just done to his pregnant wife. But there was no regret. There was no apology. Julian stood over me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His face was entirely unrecognizable. It was a mask of cold, unadulterated hatred. "The one who needs to get the hell out of here is you." His voice was dangerously quiet, dripping with absolute disgust. "You are completely crazy. Do not ever touch her." I looked past his shoulder. Chloe was standing safely behind him. A tiny, victorious smirk played on the corner of her lips. Her eyes danced with triumph. She had won. He had chosen her. The narrative was complete. I was the crazy, abusive sister, and she was the helpless victim he had to protect with physical force. In that fraction of a second, the fog of the last 6 months vanished completely. I was not looking at my husband and my sister. I was looking at two dangerous predators who had invaded my home. I realized with terrifying clarity that I could not protect my baby if I stayed in this house for one more minute. The danger was palpable. The air in the room was toxic. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not utter a single word in my defense. Silence became my armor. I pulled myself up from the bookshelf. I kept my hands wrapped tightly around my stomach. I walked past them, stepping out of the office and into the hallway. I grabbed my long coat and my car keys from the hook by the front door. I stepped out into the freezing night. The cold air hit my burning cheek. I got into my car. I slammed the door and locked it. I started the engine. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of the driveway. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned entirely white. My heart hammered against my ribs, keeping time with the tires on the asphalt. I did not look back at the glowing porch light of my own home. My marriage was dead on that office floor. The Julian I loved never existed. As I navigated the empty streets, the shock began to recede, leaving behind something much colder and much more dangerous: survival. I drove directly into the dark, heading straight for the only safe fortress I had left, the downtown apartment of Evangeline, my closest friend and my ruthless corporate lawyer. I arrived at Evangeline's high-rise apartment just past midnight. The city below was quiet, but my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. Evangeline took one look at my swollen, bruised cheek and immediately reached for her phone to call the police. I put my hand over hers and shook my head. I refused to cry. The time for weeping, the time for mourning my marriage, had evaporated the moment his hand struck my face. I did not need the police. I needed a digital autopsy. "I need your best private cybersecurity contractor," I told her, my voice so steady it barely sounded like my own. "I need a complete, undetected penetration and audit of the AuraSync cloud servers, and I need it done before the sun comes up." Evangeline is a ruthless corporate litigator. She did not waste time with pity. Within 45 minutes, a top-tier digital forensics expert was sitting at her dining table, his fingers flying across a pair of heavy laptops, quietly bypassing the security protocols I had originally built. We sat in silence for 4 hours, drinking black coffee, watching lines of code reflect off the dark windows. As dawn began to paint the Denver skyline in bruised shades of purple and gray, the true, horrifying architecture of my husband's betrayal materialized on the glowing monitors. The first revelation was a sharp twist of the knife. This was never just a sordid suburban affair born out of proximity and convenience. The affair was merely a biological byproduct of a meticulously engineered corporate heist. The forensic audit uncovered a hidden trail of encrypted communications and shell registries. Julian and Chloe were not just sharing my bed. They were quietly incorporating a rival software development firm. They named it Novatech. But the scope of their operation was breathtaking in its absolute cruelty. Julian was not simply walking away with a new company. He was using his absolute, unrestricted clearance as chief financial officer to systematically bleed my life's work dry. The logs showed he was not just siphoning operating capital into offshore holding accounts. He was leveraging AuraSync's solid credit rating to take out massive, high-interest commercial loans. We were looking at over $3 million in newly acquired corporate debt, all of it legally tethered directly to my name as the founder and chief executive. Simultaneously, the data packets I had caught Chloe downloading were the final pieces of a puzzle. She was not stealing random client lists. She was executing a full-scale migration of my proprietary back-end infrastructure, the absolute core of my predictive algorithms, over to the Novatech servers and on the incorporation documents for Novatech. Chloe was listed as the sole proprietor and chief executive officer. Their endgame was a masterpiece of financial malice, perfectly synchronized with my biological clock. The objective was to force AuraSync into catastrophic, unrecoverable insolvency during the exact week I was scheduled to deliver my baby. Their plan was for me to be trapped in a hospital bed, recovering from childbirth, utterly destroyed, and personally liable for millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. Meanwhile, they had already drafted preliminary pitch decks to sell the stolen, rebranded technology to a major Silicon Valley conglomerate. The projected acquisition price they were discussing in their emails was hovering around $40 million. As I read through their digital footprints, a chilling realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. The violence in my home office the night before had not been a sudden loss of control. The slap was not an emotional outburst to protect his lover. It was a calculated, premeditated tactical maneuver. Julian needed an inciting incident. He needed to provoke me into fleeing the property so he could execute the lockout phase of his plan. By running away into the night, I had handed him the exact narrative of erratic abandonment he required. The system logs showed that within 2 hours of my departure, while I was still driving through the dark streets in a state of shock, he had used that narrative as legal justification to freeze every single one of my personal and joint credit cards. He had immediately revoked my administrative passwords, canceled my security clearance, and deactivated my keycard access to both our residential property and the corporate headquarters. He had legally, financially, and physically locked me out of my own existence. Evangeline stood up, her face pale with fury. She walked over to her printer, pulled out a blank divorce petition, and slammed it down on the glass coffee table. She placed a heavy gold pen perfectly on top of the signature line. "Sign it, Tabitha," she ordered, her voice vibrating with protective rage. "We file for emergency injunctions the second the courthouse opens. We freeze his assets. We get a restraining order. We burn him to the ground today." I stared at the stark white paper. I looked at the pen. Then, slowly, methodically, I pushed the document away. "No," I said softly, the word hanging heavy in the quiet room. "If I strike now, if I show my hand, they will scramble. They will hide the money in offshore trusts. They will destroy the server logs. And they will tie me up in grueling litigation for the next 5 years while my daughter grows up in courtrooms." I leaned back against the velvet cushions, resting my hands gently on my stomach, feeling the soft, reassuring kick of my unborn child. The pain in my face was gone, replaced by a cold, mathematical focus. I will not file. I will not call my lawyers. I will not send angry texts. I will let them believe they have completely won. I will play the exact part they wrote for me, the broken, terrified, hysterical wife hiding in the shadows. I needed them arrogant. I needed them comfortable. I needed them completely blind to the trap I was about to build around them. I operated from the shadows of Evangeline's guest bedroom, transforming it into a fortified war room. My first retaliatory strike was not a legal maneuver. It was a financial one. I needed an ally with enough capital and influence to help me spring the trap. So I secretly reached out to Marcus. Marcus was the aggressive angel investor who had provided the initial seed funding for AuraSync back when it was just an ambitious concept scribbled on a napkin. He was a ruthless venture capitalist who absolutely despised disloyalty and corporate theft. We arranged a clandestine meeting in the dimly lit back booth of a highly exclusive, quiet steakhouse on the outskirts of the city. I slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. It contained every encrypted server log, every shell company registry, and the exact paper trail of the fraudulent commercial loans. I watched his eyes narrow as he methodically digested the sheer scope of Julian's audacity. Marcus did not express pity. He expressed a cold, calculated fury. He immediately reached inside his tailored jacket for his phone, fully intending to call his contacts at the regulatory agencies, but I firmly placed my hand over his to stop him. If we call the authorities right now, Julian will immediately hire a defense team, I explained, keeping my voice steady and low. They will freeze everything. They will hide the offshore money, and the ensuing legal battle will drag on for years, slowly bleeding Aura Sync to death. I do not want a long, drawn-out court case. Marcus, I want a public execution. I want Novatech to burn to the absolute ground on the exact day they try to sell it. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, assessing the cold resolve in my eyes. Then, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Tell me exactly what you need," he replied. Returning to the apartment, I opened a pristine, untraceable laptop that Marcus had procured for me. Julian was a brilliant financial officer, but he was inherently arrogant and completely ignorant about the true architecture of software engineering. He genuinely believed that by revoking my administrative access and deactivating my keycards, he had successfully locked the architect out of her own digital fortress. He did not know that 3 years ago, during a massive back-end server overhaul. I had carefully embedded a ghost credential into the deepest layer of the root directory. It was a phantom backdoor, so cleverly disguised as a routine diagnostic protocol that his newly hired cybersecurity team would never detect its presence. At 2 o'clock in the morning, while my husband and my sister were likely sleeping peacefully in my house, I slipped completely unnoticed into the Aura Sync mainframe. I located the exact data packets and proprietary algorithms Chloe had copied. I did not delete them. Deletion would trigger automated alarms and send them scrambling. Instead, I carefully wove a digital tripwire directly into the stolen source code. It was an elegant piece of sabotage, a logic bomb designed to lie completely dormant during all of their internal testing phases. The code would execute flawlessly on the Novatech servers, generating perfect simulations and beautiful investor presentations. But I rewrote the core parameters so that the moment the software was ported into a third-party ecosystem, the very second a prospective buyer attempted a live system integration, the entire architectural framework would catastrophically collapse. All the data would instantly lock down, the servers would crash, and every connected command terminal would broadcast a glaring, unerasable copyright notification, permanently and publicly branding the software as my stolen intellectual property. I planted the digital seed, flawlessly covered my tracks, and quietly logged out into the night. While I was engineering the digital snare, Evangeline was methodically tightening the legal noose. She deployed top-tier private investigators to legally obtain the original hard copies of the commercial loan applications Julian had filed. We spent days meticulously scrutinizing the ink and the digital signatures. Julian had brazenly forged my signature on over 15 separate financial instruments, successfully securing millions of dollars in fraudulent capital. Evangeline meticulously compiled every falsified document, every time-stamped internet protocol address tracing back to his private home office, and every illicit wire transfer routing number. We were not building a simple civil case for a messy divorce or standard corporate theft. We were constructing a bulletproof, devastating federal criminal dossier. The charges included multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and severe banking fraud, specifically federal wire fraud. Evangeline bound the final, damning report in a thick leather binder, holding it in a secure vault, ready to be hand-delivered to her highest contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly when the clock ran out. As the days bled into weeks, the immense stress, the relentless adrenaline, and the sheer weight of the betrayal began to take a heavy physical toll on my body. 2 weeks before my scheduled due date, my water broke in the middle of a quiet Sunday night. There was no frantic, joyous drive to the hospital with a supportive partner holding my hand and whispering words of encouragement. It was just Evangeline and me, speeding through the empty city streets in the back of a private car. I labored for 18 grueling hours in a secure, heavily guarded maternity suite, registered under a strict alias. When my daughter finally arrived, letting out a fierce, beautiful cry that echoed through the sterile room, I felt a tidal wave of overwhelming love and a terrifying, primal instinct to protect her. She was absolutely perfect. I held her warm, fragile body against my chest, making a silent, unbreakable vow that she would never know the weakness or the cruelty of the people who shared her bloodline. I strictly instructed the hospital administration and security staff to enforce a complete and total information blackout. There were no joyful social media announcements, no celebratory phone calls to extended family members, and absolutely no medical bills or insurance records forwarded to my residential address. As far as Julian and Chloe knew, I was still heavily pregnant, hiding somewhere in profound shame, completely and utterly defeated. I spent the next 10 days in absolute seclusion, focusing entirely on my physical recovery, nursing my newborn daughter, and gathering my strength. The scattered pieces were now perfectly aligned. The board was irreversibly set. All I had to do was wait in the silence for them to confidently make their final, fatal move. The day of their ultimate triumph dawned bright and clear over the Denver skyline. Julian and Chloe had rented a breathtaking, glass-walled executive boardroom on the 50th floor of a premier downtown high-rise. This was the moment they were going to solidify their betrayal. They had gathered the senior acquisition executives from a massive Silicon Valley conglomerate to sign the final paperwork for the sale of Novatech. The agreed-upon purchase price was $40 million. According to Evangeline's informants, Julian was practically vibrating with arrogance, pouring expensive champagne and charming the investors, entirely confident that I was still cowering in the suburbs, paralyzed by fear and the final heavy weeks of my pregnancy. They were all sitting around a massive marble table. The lead investor had a gold pen in his hand, hovering right above the signature line of the binding contract. That was the exact moment I pushed open the heavy oak double doors. The sound of the heavy doors swinging open echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, luxurious room. Every single head turned. The smug, victorious smiles on Julian and Chloe's faces completely vanished, replaced by an ashen, horrified pallor. I was not the broken, weeping, heavily pregnant woman they had violently discarded. I walked into that room wearing a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight. Resting securely in my arms was my newborn daughter, sleeping peacefully, completely undisturbed by the tension radiating through the room. Flanking me on my right was Evangeline, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Flanking me on my left, and spilling into the hallway behind us, were 6 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned in bold yellow across their backs. "Tabitha?" Julian choked out, his voice cracking violently. He dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at home." I did not even look at him. I looked directly at the Silicon Valley executives, who were now staring at the federal agents in absolute confusion and rising panic. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room, "before you sign that document and legally implicate yourselves in the purchase of stolen intellectual property, I suggest you take a closer look at the software integration you are about to buy." Julian frantically lunged toward his laptop at the front of the room, desperate to shut down this presentation screen, but he was far too late. With a single tap on my secure mobile device, I activated the logic bomb I had planted weeks ago. The massive digital display behind Julian suddenly violently flickered. The beautiful, sleek interface of the Novatech software froze. The simulation they had been boasting about catastrophically crashed. The screen went pitch black for exactly 3 seconds. Then, it flashed a blinding, aggressive crimson red in massive, bold white letters. A single sentence broadcast across the room. "Intellectual property exclusively owned by Tabitha Cannon." The lead investor slammed his pen down on the marble table, his face flushing with fury. He looked at Julian, then at the stolen code warning on the screen, and finally at the federal agents. The deal evaporated in less than a second. Evangeline stepped forward, opening her briefcase. "Julian Cannon," she announced, her voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. "You are looking at federal indictments for aggravated identity theft, corporate espionage, and over 15 counts of federal wire fraud totaling more than $3 million. The lead federal agent moved in swiftly. "Julian Cannon, put your hands behind your back." The sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around Julian's wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. He did not fight back. He completely crumbled, his knees visibly buckling as the agents dragged him toward the door. Suddenly, a piercing, hysterical shriek shattered the room. It was Chloe. She scrambled backward, knocking over her leather chair, pointing a trembling finger at the man she had conspired with. "It was him!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face, desperately playing the victim one final time. "He manipulated me. I did not know the code was stolen. He made me do it. Please, I am just his assistant." Evangeline let out a cold, merciless laugh. "Save it for the judge. Chloe, your signature is on the incorporation documents as the sole proprietor of Novatech. You are the primary beneficiary of the stolen trade secrets." Another agent grabbed Chloe by the arm, securing her wrists in cuffs as she thrashed and sobbed, crying out my name, begging me to help her. I stood completely still, shielding my sleeping baby's ears from her frantic screaming. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of mercy. I simply watched as they were both marched out of the glass room, their entire lives dismantled, reduced to absolute ashes in front of the very people they had tried to impress. The fallout was swift and legally devastating, because Evangeline and I provided irrefutable proof of federal financial fraud and forgery, the massive corporate debts Julian had taken out under my name were completely nullified by the banks. Furthermore, to compensate for the emotional and financial damages inflicted upon me, the court seized every single asset Julian possessed. 100% of his shares in AuraSync Solutions were legally transferred back to me. He was left with absolutely nothing. 2 years later, the air in my life is finally clear and light. AuraSync has grown exponentially, and I have risen to become one of the most powerful and respected female chief executive officers in the tech industry. I am standing in the sunlit living room of our brand new, beautiful home, watching my 2-year-old daughter take her confident, wobbly steps across the soft carpet. I never visited Julian in federal prison. I never accepted a single one of the collect calls Chloe tried to make from her state facility. I cut the rot out of my life entirely. I learned the hardest lesson a person can learn. True family is not determined by the people who share your bloodline, but are willing to sell you out for a payout. True family consists of the people who stand fiercely by your side when you have absolutely nothing left. Through the fire and the betrayal, I did not just survive. I built an impenetrable empire for my daughter, and no one will ever tear it down. Thank you so much to everyone who took the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging, please remember that this channel will unfortunately not be uploading any new videos in the near future as we transition our operations entirely to Patreon. Please help support us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel to hear the absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that are much longer and simply cannot be made public on YouTube. You can easily join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon page link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video.